So the United States just asked Canada for a $573 billion railway bailout. Not offered one, asked for one. The most powerful economy in the history of the world. The nation that has spent 2 years imposing tariffs, trade restrictions, sovereignty violations, and sustained economic coercion on its closest ally, just ask that ally to please restore the freight rail service that American industry depends on to function. Because the North American railway system, it turns out, is Canadian. The trains are Canadian. The tracks are Canadian. The logistics networks that scheduled the movement of American grain, American auto parts, American crude oil, American chemicals, American lumber, and American consumer goods are headquartered in Montreal and Calgary, two of the 7 Class I railroads in North America, Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, are Canadian-owned, Canadian-operated companies that run extensive networks inside the United States on American soil, carrying American freight, connecting American cities. And when Canada redirected its trade away from the United States toward global markets, the railways followed the trade. The trains that used to run south to Chicago and Detroit and Memphis are running east to Halifax and Montreal and west to Vancouver and Prince Rupert, because that's where the demand is now. And American factories can't get parts. American farmers can't ship grain. American refineries can't receive crude. American retailers can't stock shelves. And the estimated cost of the disruption, the backed-up freight, the idle production, the rotting grain, the cascading inefficiency spreading through every sector of the American economy is $573 billion over 3 years. And Canada said no. Not just no. Canada announced a $30 billion east-west rail corridor expansion, a massive infrastructure investment that permanently redirects Canadian freight capacity toward global export ports and away from the American border. The bailout was refused. The infrastructure that would have served American industry is being built in a different direction, and every dollar of concrete poured on the east-west corridor is a dollar of capacity that will never return to north-south service. Warren Buffett, who owns BNSF Railway, one of the largest freight carriers in North America, and who has spent 60 years studying the economics of moving goods by rail, said this is the most predictable infrastructure crisis in American history. And then he explained with the authority of someone who doesn't just study railways but owns one, why you cannot wage economic war on the country that owns your rail network and expect the trains to run on time, and why asking for a bailout from the nation you've been coercing isn't a negotiation strategy. It's a confession. But the line that is being called the most humiliating sentence ever directed at an American president by an allied leader, the line Carney delivered when asked whether Canada would consider Trump's railway stabilization proposal, is 9 words that told the United States something no ally has ever had the leverage or the reason to say you don't get to break it, and then ask us to fix it. When you understand how the North American railway system actually works, and who owns it, how the trade war cascaded into a rail logistics collapse that nobody in Washington modeled, what $573 billion of damage looks like on the ground across every major American industry, why Trump asked for a bailout, and what the request reveals what Canada's building instead of restoring service, what Buffett said about the most basic law of transportation economics, and why American farmers and factory workers in swing states are the ones paying the price. You'll understand why this isn't a logistics disruption. It's the moment the most powerful economy on Earth discovered it can't move its own goods. Hit subscribe because this railway crisis is about to hit American grocery prices, American factory output, and American farm income simultaneously, and every fix goes through Ottawa. To understand how the most powerful economy on Earth ended up asking its neighbor for a railway bailout, you have to understand something that almost nobody, including apparently the people who designed the trade war, knew about how goods actually move in North America. The North American freight railway system is not 3 separate national networks that happen to connect at border crossings. It is a single integrated continental system designed over a century and a half to move goods across the continent, with maximum efficiency and minimum friction. The US-Canada border is not a dividing line in the system. It is a seam in visible and normal operation, seamless in practice, and so thoroughly integrated into the logistics architecture of both nations that most people forgot it was there, including the people who decided to tear it. The revelation that stuns most Americans when they encounter it, and that reportedly stunned the President of the United States when it was explained to him in a briefing, is who owns the system. Canadian National Railway, headquartered in Montreal, operates a rail network that stretches from the Canadian Atlantic coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Its American operations span Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Tennessee. CN doesn't just carry Canadian goods across the border, it carries American goods within the United States, grain from the Midwest to Gulf ports, chemicals from Louisiana to factories in the Northeast, automatic components between plants across the industrial heartland. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, headquartered in Calgary, was formed by the merger of Canadian Pacific Railway and Kansas City Southern, creating the only single-line rail network connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico. CPKC operates across the American Midwest, the Southern Plains, the Gulf Coast, and into Mexico, carrying everything from pesh to petroleum to interodal containers. These are not small operations supplementing an American-dominated system. CN and CPKC are two of the 7 Class I railroads in North America, the designation reserved for the continent's largest freight carriers. Together with their Canadian domestic operations, they control a substantial share of all cross-border freight movement. They own the track, they own the locomotives, they own the rolling stock, they employ the crews, they set the schedules, they allocate the capacity, and they make those decisions in Canadian boardrooms under Canadian corporate governance, reflecting Canadian commercial interests. What these railways carry for the American economy reads like a bill of materials for the country itself. Grain from Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and the Dakotas to export terminals and domestic processors. Crude oil from Canadian fields to American refineries across the Midwest and Gulf. Automotive parts between cross-border manufacturing plants. The same integrated auto supply chain that was already fracturing chemicals, fertilizers, lumber, steel, potash, manufactured goods, consumer products, and interodal containers carrying everything from electronics to clothing from Pacific ports to inland distribution centers. Modern freight logistics runs on precision rail cars scheduled to arrive within hours of when they're needed, inventory systems calibrated to rail delivery timelines, production schedules built around the assumption that the freight will flow. There is no strategic reserve of auto parts sitting in a warehouse. There is no backup grain elevator waiting to absorb a harvest that can't move. The system works because it is reliable. It was reliable because the cross-border relationship was functional. When the relationship broke, the reliability broke with it, and nobody in Washington had modeled what would happen next. And here is what happened. When the trade war collided with the reality of who owns the railways, because the disruption didn't arrive in a single dramatic action, it arrived the same way every crisis in this confrontation has arrived, through cascading, compounding, second-order consequences that the architects of the trade war never considered because they never looked past the first-order effects of their own policies. As Canada systematically redirected its exports away from the United States and toward global markets, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Asia, the Indo-Pacific, the demand for north-south cross-border rail capacity declined. Fewer Canadian goods heading south means fewer trains heading south. Simultaneously, demand for east-west rail capacity surged. Canadian producers needed to move goods to port cities for ocean export to the new markets that were replacing American buyers. Halifax on the Atlantic, Montreal, Vancouver, and Prince Rupert on the Pacific. The ports were growing. The rail traffic to the ports was growing. And CNN and CPKC, as rational businesses responding to market signals, reallocated capacity accordingly. More trains heading east and west, fewer trains heading south. The reallocation wasn't ordered by the Canadian government. It wasn't a political decision. It was a commercial one. Capacity follows demand. Demand follows trade. And trade had been deliberately, systematically redirected by the very tariffs and restrictions that the United States had imposed. The compounding effect was devastating. Canada's various trade countermeasures, energy restrictions, mineral export controls, agricultural redirection, auto parts protocols, all reduced the volume of goods crossing the border by rail. Less cross-border trade meant less cross-per rail demand. Less demand meant less allocated capacity. Less capacity meant longer wait times, less reliable scheduling in a freight system that was becoming progressively dysfunctional for American shippers, not because anyone declared a rail embargo, but because the economic incentives that had made north-south service efficient and reliable had been methodically destroyed by the trade war itself. Canadian railways also began prioritizing Canadian domestic and export shipments over American cross-border freight, a rational commercial decision aligned with where revenue and volume were growing. American shippers weren't blocked, they were deprioritized. Their freight moved later, slower with less predictability. And in a logistics system built on precision timing, later and slower means the entire downstream system, factories, distribution centers, retailers, consumers breaks, and the consequences hit the American economy like a slow-motion avalanche. Invisible at first, then everywhere at once. American grain elevators across the Midwest filled to capacity and stayed full. Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, the Dakotas, farmers harvesting crops with nowhere to store them because the elevators couldn't empty, because the trains that would normally carry the grain to export terminals and processing facilities weren't coming at the frequency or reliability they once did. Grain sitting in elevators for weeks instead of days degrades. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, pest exposure. Grain that sits too long loses grade, loses certification, loses the premium pricing that makes the difference between a profitable harvest and a ruinous one. Millions of tons of American grain at risk of spoilage, not because of drought, not because of disease, not because of a natural disaster, but because the trains that carry it are running east and west now instead of south. Livestock operations dependent on rail delivered feed reported shortfalls. Feedlots in Kansas and Texas paying premium prices for trucked grain because rail delivery had become unreliable. Agricultural export windows. The tight timelines during which American grain competes on global commodity markets against Brazilian, Argentine, Australian, and Canadian grain missed because the freight couldn't move fast enough. The automotive sector faced a compound crisis. The Canadian parts restrictions were already strangling assembly lines. Now the logistics system that delivers the parts that do clear trade barriers was itself degrading. Parts that cleared the export protocol sat in rail yards waiting for capacity. Components that were supposed to arrive in hours arrived in weeks. Assembly lines that were already running at reduced capacity due to part shortages now faced the additional insult of logistics failures on the parts that were available. The two crises didn't add, they multiplied. Energy shipments by rail, crude oil, natural gas liquids, propane heating fuel slowed across the Midwest and northern states. Refineries running below capacity because rail-delivered crude arrived late. Propane distribution to rural communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan disrupted ahead of winter. Communities that depend on rail delivered propane for heating, facing the prospect of shortage during the coldest months. Chemical plants reporting raw material delays of 2 to 4 weeks. Retail distribution centers across the northern United States reporting inventory gaps as intermodal container movement slowed. Consumer prices climbing as logistics costs spiked. Trucking, the only alternative to rail, costs 3 to 5 times more per ton mile, and the trucking industry doesn't have the capacity to absorb the overflow. The American Logistics Association called it the most severe freight disruption since World War II. The projected economic cost calculated from delayed shipments, lost production, agricultural spoilage, expedited trucking costs, manufacturing idle time, supply chain restructuring, and cascading inefficiencies was $573 billion over 3 years. The number broke down across every sector. Agricultural losses exceeding $85 billion, manufacturing disruptions surpassing $140 billion, energy supply chain costs above $55 billion, direct freight delay costs above $120 billion, cascading consumer price increases and competitive losses making up the rest. Every dollar traceable through a chain of cause and effect to a trade war that disrupted the trade, which disrupted the rail, which disrupted everything the rail carries, which is everything. And then Trump did something no American president has ever done in the history of the bilateral relationship. He asked Canada for help. The administration proposed a joint North American railway stabilization framework, a bilateral agreement that would restore full cross-Purr freight rail service, guarantee American shippers priority access to Canadian rail networks, and share the infrastructure investment costs between the two governments. The proposal was framed as mutual continental logistics coordination and shared infrastructure investment diplomatic language designed to obscure the fundamental dynamic. The United States asking Canada to restore a service that Canada has no obligation to provide during a trade war. The United States started because American industry cannot function without it. The humiliation was structural and inescapable. Strip the diplomatic language away, and the picture is a superpower that has spent 2 years imposing tariffs, demanding compliance, threatening alliances, weaponizing food, restricting trade, and coercing its neighbor into submission. Now, asking that neighbor to please make the trains run again because its own economy is seizing up. The nation that called Canada a gas station with snow was asking the gas station for a ride. The nation that demanded Canada's Prime Minister resign was now requesting Canada's cooperation on a $573 billion logistics emergency. Trump's public framing was revealing in its obliviousness. We need Canada to be a responsible partner in continental infrastructure responsible. The nation that endured 18 months of economic warfare was being asked to act responsibly. Behind the scenes, one moment captured the entire crisis. Reports from 3 officials familiar with the briefing described Trump asking his advisors a single question during the presentation on the rail disruption. Why do they own our railways? The answer that CNN and CPKC are private companies that acquired American rail assets over decades through legitimate corporate transactions approved by American regulators through open market purchases. That the United States welcomed and facilitated reportedly produced a silence in the room that lasted considerably longer than the explanation itself. The President of the United States had just learned in real time that Canadian companies own critical American infrastructure, and the answer to his question was because you let them, because you approved it, because you never considered that the country you decided to punish might be the country that moves your freight. And Canada's response was not what Washington expected. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a refusal softened with diplomatic regret. It was something worse. It was a plan. Canada formally declined the Joint Railway Stabilization Framework. The refusal was delivered through a formal diplomatic communication and a simultaneous public statement. No ambiguity, no opening for renegotiation, no suggestion that the terms could be adjusted. The stated reasoning was clinical. Canada is under no obligation to subsidize freight service that benefits industries in a country that has imposed tariffs, trade restrictions, and economic coercion on Canadian producers and Canadian workers. Cross-Purr rail service is a commercial function operated by private Canadian companies, making rational decisions based on current trade volumes and future market projections. Canada will not distort those commercial decisions to absorb the consequences of another government's trade policy. And then Canada announced what it would be building instead: the $30 billion East-West Rail Corridor expansion, the largest single rail infrastructure investment in Canadian history. Expanded capacity to the Port of Vancouver, the Port of Prince Rort, Canada's Pacific gateways to Asian markets. Expanded capacity to the Port of Halifax and the Port of Montreal, Atlantic gateways to European markets. New intermodal terminals connecting inland production centres to both coasts. Double tracking and capacity upgrades on the transcontinental main lines, and the provision that connected everything. New rail links integrating the East-West corridor with Canada's Arctic shipping infrastructure, creating a single logistics chain from Canadian mine to Canadian rail to Canadian port to Arctic shipping corridor to global customer. With the United States nowhere in the chain, every dollar of East-West infrastructure is a dollar of capacity that serves Canadian global exports. Every ton of freight capacity added to East-West service is a ton of capacity that is not available for North-South cross. Canada isn't just refusing the bailout. Canada's building the infrastructure that makes the American rail dependency permanent, because the new East-West capacity will generate its own revenue, attract its own shippers, and create its own demand. The east-west corridor doesn't need the old north-south traffic to be economically viable. It is self-sustaining, and self-sustaining infrastructure doesn't get torn up because someone else's politics change. CNN and CPKC issued statements supporting the expansion and confirming that capacity allocation decisions are made on commercial grounds. Where demand grows, capacity follows. Demand is growing east and west. Demand is declining north-south. The railways are following the market.